everybody. Thank you so much for joining me back on my channel, Hierarchy of Reads. My name is Tiffany, and today I am here to go over the books that I've read in January, February, and March because I have not done a wrap-up video or a video at all year long. As I mentioned in a previous video, I haven't been reading as much this year, so I have a lot less to cover, but I'm going to go ahead and start with what I read in January. In January, I read the novel Putney by Sofka Zinoviev. I'm probably mispronouncing that, and I apologize to the author. And I read this along with Karen from Run Right Reads. This book is a Lolita-esque novel about a woman who experiences sexual abuse throughout her life and kind of talks about how she accepts that and comes to realize how that's affected her and her relationships and her family and her friends. It's been such a long time since I've read this that I don't remember many details. I did update it a little bit on my Goodreads page, so you could potentially find it there if you're interested. I ended up giving this book 3 out of 5 stars. I didn't enjoy it as much as everybody else seemed to, and though I think that some aspects of the writing were done quite brilliantly, a lot of the development and the plot, I think, was just pretty average. One thing I do remember that this novel did particularly well was the exploration of the more subtle ways in which sexual assault, and particularly in development, can manifest itself in a person's cognitions and behaviors. And I think some thought processes and behaviors that aren't normally discussed or talked about in novels talking about sexual assault were mentioned here, and I really appreciated that. I do think I would recommend this to a person who is interested in the plot of the book or the theme that the book touches on. The next book that I read in, I believe it was January as well, yes, it was January, is The Road by Cormac McCarthy, and I read this for Adrian and Dalton's read-along on their channel Stripped Cover Lit, and I also ended up reading this book 3 out of 5 stars. It was pretty meh for me. I'm really at a loss to understand people's polarizing evaluation of this book. There is a set of people who despise it with all of their being, and then there are those who praise it as one of the top books, and I don't understand either end of the spectrum. I think that there's a lot of thematic content in here that is really well done, and I'm not going to go into the description of this book because I'm pretty sure pretty much everybody at some point has heard of it, but I would recommend it. I think it's worth reading. The next book that I read was actually read in February, and it was actually, I listened to it as an audiobook, and it was my first ever audiobook experience. And that was Lean In, Women, Work, and the Will to Leave by Sheryl Sandberg. And first I'm going to talk about my experience with audiobooks, and then I'm going to talk about the book itself. So, as I mentioned, it was the first time that I had listened to a book on audiobook, and I enjoyed it. Mostly because during this time I was just unable to focus on reading something. So it was nice to be able to still absorb content without having to actually do the physical reading part. But I don't think that I retain information as well or integrate it into my existing body of knowledge as well as when I physically read it from the page. And I also didn't like that I was unable to, keep track of certain passages or mark certain spots or anything like that. As far as this book, I ended up rating it 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed this book a lot more than I thought I would. I picked this book up originally because I had watched a documentary in one of my psych classes called Misrepresentation, I think, and Sheryl Sandberg was featured in that documentary, and I liked some of the things that she said, and when I found out that she had this book out, I wanted to read it. But actually, I found it to be quite useful. Some of the information that she shares, none of it is really particularly new, but it's a good reminder. I do think that this book could be particularly helpful for some women or certain personality types, actually, that are trying to be successful in the workforce. The next book that I read in February was Solaris by Stanislaw Lem. And this is a science fiction novel. I read this because Adam at the channel Memento Mori was reading this as part of his book to film club that I have tried to keep up with but have not. And this book was an interesting experience because I don't read a lot of science fiction, and as I'm saying that, I realize I don't think I've ever read any science fiction. And the beginning of this book was amazing to me. I loved it so much. I was getting so excited about, what was going on and how it was being written about. And I thought for certain I would end up rating this 5 stars. However, I feel as though the second half of this book got a little bit away of itself and delved way too deep into metaphysical conversations to the point where it made sense, but hardly, and it just became boring and laborious to read. So for that reason, I ended up rating this 3 out of 5 stars. And if you're interested in science fiction classics, I might suggest you read it. But for the average reader who is just somewhat interested in science fiction, I'm not sure I would recommend it. I do think the idea of a sentient ocean planet that can adjust itself according to its needs is brilliant. It's just the way that it was handled towards the end that I didn't like. The next 2 books that I read in February were actually on audiobook, so I don't have the physical book. The first book I read was The Blood of Emmett Till by Timothy B. Tyson, and I rated this book 5 stars. This is a book that looks into the murder of Emmett Till, and it does something that I really like, which is it tells the story, but through the telling of the story, it weaves in information about the environment and about the political scene going on and the social scene going on, because all of these contribute to the environment that allowed for this to happen. And I can't explain to you how hard-hitting this book was to me, because I'm not trying to compare so cleanly today's climate to the climate of then. However, there are so many parallels and similarities all this time later that it's heartbreaking, because you really see how the fundamental factors that contribute to this kind of thing happening has not changed at all. And so it was heartbreaking, and it was really, really well done. I loved this reading experience. One of the things that I read in a lot of reviews was this idea that the book was bad and the book was faulty because the author sympathized with the person who is the woman who made the false accusation that then led to Emmett Till getting murdered. And I think that that's a very strange critique of the book, because nowhere in my listening to the book, did I feel as though the author was trying to create a sense of sympathy for her. He did mention her, and he did write about what she thought about the situation after the fact and her regret, but he never tries to excuse what she did. And that was a very interesting finding that I had. I would be interested if any of you have read this book. I'd like to know what your thoughts on that were. The next book that I read or listened to on audiobook was Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir of a family and culture in crisis by J.D. Vance. I really enjoyed this book. In a lot of ways, it was because I resonated with a lot of the experiences and feelings and situations that J.D. Vance was writing about. And as he was telling his story, one thing after another, I kept thinking, oh my goodness, me too. Not the same situations necessarily, but so similar that the differences ultimately didn't matter. I really appreciated towards the end of the book, as he's talking about how his environment as a young child and growing up, how that affected him as an adult. And what I particularly enjoyed about the book is how he talks about how he had to battle his own cognitions. He really had to overcome some of the maladapted traits and thought processes that he had learned. And that's something that I don't often see talked about so directly in a book. And I really appreciated that. And the other thing I appreciate is the fact that J.D. Vance, even though he's not exempt from bias because it's his story he's telling, but he really clearly did his homework and his research, trying to give the most unbiased account for what happened to him. And also, you could tell that he wasn't trying to look at his environment. He wasn't trying to look at the people in his life to judge them. He was trying to understand. So there's only 2 more books for me to talk about. And the second to last book that I read is Women Talking by Miriam Toews. I think that's how you pronounce her name. Again, I apologize if I mispronounced it. I was really excited for this book. This book is talking about a group of women in a Mennonite colony who were raped repeatedly and then told by the male members of the colony that it was demons, and come to find out they were men in the colony. And it's based on a true story, which is heartbreaking. And I was really looking forward to this book because it's been plastered all over BookTube, Instagram. So many people have been talking about this, and I was pretty disappointed. It's not even just that this book doesn't have much of a plot. I'm not a particularly plot-driven person. I can read a book if it has really good substance. And this book had substance, don't get me wrong, but the substance wasn't the substance I was looking for. This book talks a lot about interpretation of religious texts and how to apply the principles of the religion to a situation. And I can see that being useful and interesting to many readers, but to me it was not. I ended up rating this 2 out of 5 stars. The writing wasn't for me, the story wasn't for me, the conversations weren't for me, but I think that for many readers this could be something of interest, and many booktubers have loved it. The final book that I listened to was The Radium Girls, The Dark Story of America's Shining Women by Kate Moore. And I didn't end up rating this audiobook because I didn't finish it. And that was primarily because I was renting it through Overdrive on my phone and I had to return it before I could finish it. It was so long. And I can say that I listened to a little bit less than half of it and I was really enjoying it. It's a pretty dark discussion about women who were working in the radium factories painting watch dials, and the finding that the radium was toxic and what was happening to these women because of it. And it was heartbreaking and it was also fascinating. But it was so much detail, and at first the detail didn't bother me, but it was repeating the same details about all these different people, and I just kind of wanted it to hurry up and get over with. And so then when it expired, I just didn't bother to rent it again because I felt as though, I pretty much know what it's going to say over and over again. So those are all of the books that I have read so far this year. As I mentioned before, my reading has been pretty slow this year, and I can't guarantee that I'm going to pick up speed or pace anytime soon because I'm still dealing with a lot of personal matters, but I'm really hoping to. I would love to know your favorite books that you have read this month or so far this year. But beyond that, I look forward to seeing you in my next video, and until then, be well.